Hello everybody and shalom. This is my testimony. My name is Syreeta, aka Riri, for those of you who follow me on Facebook. I'm gonna let you know up front, my testimony is long, and the more I prayed about it and tried to figure out, are there pieces that I can cut? I figure that any pieces that can be cut, the Ruach will cut, otherwise it's going to be long. And the reason why is because there's a lot of pieces that build upon each other that have brought me to the place that I am today, that I'm at today. And so, without further ado, we shall begin. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and my family moved around a couple times. My dad was in the Marine Corps, and we ended up stationed in Yuma when I was 4 years old. And the reason I go so far back is because part of my entire story, which I believe were the building blocks that led me to where I am today, is it started when I was young. And the way that it started out was my mother, she felt like she was meant to stay home with us kids. I was raised in a Christian home, and but she felt a call to stay home with us. And so she did work for a part of the time while I was really little, but I think it was around the time she got saved, that she felt she needed to stay home with us, and so she stayed home and raised us. But she didn't just stay home and raise us, she also homeschooled us. And so myself and my three other siblings, so there's four of us, we were all homeschooled from the age of kindergarten to graduating high school. And so it was like from the beginning, Yahuwah was setting me apart, even from a young child, even though I was still raised in, the typical Christian background. I almost want to say there was still something that was different about my parents. And the way I kind of compare it to was almost like the story of Moses, where, his mom knew that she had to hide him because she knew he was a special child. And so growing up, I look back and I can see how for me, that was a special upbringing. And so, like I said, I was raised in a Christian home. My dad was in the Marine Corps. He was stationed in Japan, actually, when I was born. And and there was when he became a Christian. And then 2 years later, my mom became a Christian when my family was stationed in California. And that's where my next sister was born. And then we were stationed east. I forget which state. I don't remember it, so I always forget which state. But we were stationed back east for a small period of time, and then we were moved to Arizona. So Arizona is pretty much all I've ever known. And so here's where I grew up, and so I pretty much call it home. And like I said, I was homeschooled. About the age of 16 was when I had kind of an experience. I grew up in church. I sang in church choirs, and I took piano lessons from age 9 to 11, and was always involved in music. And so age 16 was when I first kind of started hearing this call. And I was listening. My mom had, I think, the radio playing one night, and I was listening to it, and it was some guy talking about how, how Jesus was coming back one day, and with the host of heaven, and he was describing it, and he didn't even ask this question, but it was just like I felt this question, like, will you be ready? And I kind of thought, I don't think I'll be ready. And my background was, I was the good Christian kid who, I didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't get into trouble, all that, stuff that we're told, is sins and the things that we should not do. And so, but at the same time, I just felt this prick, like, I don't think I'd be ready. And so that night I prayed prayer, and that was kind of the start of me walking with God. But what I didn't know is that this father of the Bible, not the Christian God, but this creator that's talked about in the Bible, he was the one calling me. But in my mind, it was this Christian God and Jesus that is talked about. And so that's who I associated it with. But I realized later, at that very early age, it was the creator of the Bible, Yahuwah, who was calling me. And at that point, I sat down and I, somewhere during that point, I started to write a song. And because there was a verse that was speaking to me that it kept pinging against my ruach. And it's the verse in Exodus 9:16, and it says, "And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show in thee my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth." And it would take me years to realize the immense significance of Yahuwah giving me that verse at that time. And I will hopefully remember to get to that later. So at that point, I got heavily involved in our church. My sister and I were leading the kids' church praise and worship. And there were some powerful and interesting things that were going on during that time that kind of woke me up to the fact that there was, something on me. There was a calling on my life. And I didn't understand all the ramifications of it at that time, of course, but I would come to realize that later. And during that time, I was kind of trying to decide what I was going to do with my life, after I graduated and all that stuff. And it seemed random, not entirely random, but partly random. One lady in our church, she said, "Oh, you should think about going to Master's Commission." And I was like, I hadn't really thought about doing that. Master's Commission is a discipleship program out of Tommy Barnett's church here in Phoenix, where I live now. And so I didn't really think much about it when she said that. And then a second lady said the same thing, and neither of them were in the same conversation with each other. So it was like two random occurrences. I don't think this is random. And the second lady said the exact same thing. "You should think about going to Master's Commission." And at that point I thought, okay, I'm going to tell it to my mom. And, all of us kids have been, home with my parents, and we were homeschooled. And so I'm thinking, mom's not going to want to let me go. So if mom says no, then And so I told my mom, and she shocked me. And she's like, you should really pray about it. You should think about going. I was like, okay, I guess this is supposed to happen. And so at the age of 20, I moved to Phoenix and went to Master's Commission. And while, again, it was, all part of the whole pagan Christian system, it did lead me to where I ended up today. So again, it's a relevant part of the story. And so I spent a few years there. And during that time, I realized, looking back now, how worldly I became being a part of that program. Because up until that point, I had been set apart. I hadn't been in the public school system. I hadn't been exposed to a lot of the, things of the world. And so it was at that point I began to change and kind of began to become this chameleon, where I became more having more of a worldly outlook, so to say. And so I spent a few years there, and a few years in, I felt that I was supposed to go to one of the branch programs that's in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, which is about an hour out of Toronto. And so I went there, and I spent a year there. And while I was there for about 11 months, and towards the end of those 11 months, I began to get sick. And I didn't know what was going on. I was not familiar with the symptoms I was having. And so I just kind of ignored them, hoping they would go away. Turns out they were not going to go away, and Yahuwah, in his providence, he set me where I was put with a lady who happened to be a nurse. Her name was Evelyn, and I knew that she was sent to help me. And so she recognized my symptoms immediately. She said, "You need to get to the hospital." And so I was taken to the hospital, and I'm complaining because I'm like, I don't have any insurance. I'm living in Canada. I'm not, I couldn't get a paycheck because, I'm a foreigner. And so, I didn't have insurance, and I'm going, I don't have insurance. I can't pay for this. She's like, it doesn't matter. You need to get to the hospital. And so she took me to the hospital. There I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, which is the juvenile kind. I was a late diagnosis, but it usually shows up before age 30, and I was 25 when that happened. And so I was diagnosed with that. I, again, had no job, no insurance, no money, and so I was praying about it, and I felt like I need to come back to the States, and so that's what I did. So I came back to the States, and so I was with my parents. I flew back into Phoenix. I think they came and picked me up and took me back to Yuma. And so for 3 months, I was kind of just spending time trying to figure out what this, disease is that I now have, and how to deal with it. And I spent so much time studying the subject that I ended up knowing more about type 1 diabetes than the doctor that I went to. And so I could tell when I opened my mouth and I was telling him all about it that I knew more than he did, and the intimidated look on his face told me that I knew more than he did. And I'm like, how can you help me when I know more than you do? And so meanwhile, I was feeling this niggling voice that was saying I needed to go back to Phoenix. That I wasn't supposed to be in Yuma, that I needed to go back. And I was fighting the voice, and I was like, I don't want to go back to Phoenix. I'm sick and tired of dealing with all this stuff. And at that point, it just felt like, everything had crashed, and, I wasn't involved in music anymore, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And it was the first point in my life where I felt like I was battling depression. And I was at the point where I didn't feel like I wanted to live anymore. And I was like, what is going back to Phoenix going to do? I don't want to go back to Phoenix. And so I fought that battle for a couple months, and then finally I said, okay, I knew him as God then. And I was like, okay, God, if that's what you want me to do, I will go back to Phoenix. So I moved back to Phoenix, and this was early December, and it was just before a friend's wedding. And so I came back just before her wedding, and so I was at her wedding, and she goes to throw the bouquet, and I actually caught it. And I kind of laughed because it was the first time I'd ever caught a bouquet. I'd been to, enough weddings, but never caught a bouquet. And I thought that was weird. It was like, okay, that's strange. And then a month later, the worship leader for Master's Commission, she told us that the church had called her up. They had heard about our program. We would go into churches and kind of work with their worship teams. And so they had called them up because they had heard good things from another church that the worship team had worked with, and so they wanted us to come in and help them with their worship team. And so I was part of the team that went to that church, and I didn't know it then, but that was the first time I don't think I actually met him that night, but that was the first time I walked into the church where I would meet my husband at. And so we kept going back, and they brought us in on a Wednesday night, and it was like a dinky service. It's like this building that fits, seats like 500 or 600, but or maybe not quite that many, but it seated quite a few, and it was like 25 people there. And we were like, okay. And they're like, yeah, we're trying to grow this service. And so we kept going back, and then I was kind of assigned as the person to run the team that was helping their worship team. And eventually I met my husband, and the only thing I remember about the guy the first time was he would sit on the front row while we were practicing, and he would yell out, "Don't be bashful!" And I was just kind of looking at him like, what? I thought he was crazy, and so a few more weeks of him doing that, and he would keep saying that, and I look at him like, he's kind of cute. I didn't think much more beyond that, but I was like, okay, yeah, the guy's kind of cute. He's kind of cute. And so it was late April. We had been there for about 3 months, and their service was growing and stuff, and things were going well. And then now my husband, I get this text out of the blue from the guy, Jeff, and he's like, what did he say? He says something like, can I get a copy of these forms or something like that? And I'm just thrown for a tizzy, like, this guy's texting me. Where is this coming from? And I texted him back, and I was like, how'd you get my number? And he's like, oh, it's on the overhead. I put it on the overhead for, advertising for musicians and singers. And I was like, duh, okay, yeah. And he texted back, and he was like, well, if I'm bothering you, I'll leave you alone. And right then I knew I was in a quandary, because it was like, if I texted the guy and told him he was messing with me, I knew he would never text me back again. And I would never hear from him again. I would see him, but he would never say anything again. And so I thought about it, and I said, okay, you're not bothering me. And so that's how it got started between me and him. And it was a whirlwind, but it was interesting because we were both, I don't want to say older, but we were, we weren't late 20s. We were our early 20s. We were in our late 20s. And so he had spent a year in Africa. I had spent a year in Canada. And being a part of Master's Commission, I had traveled all over the States. And he had gotten to travel all over the world. His dad was in the Army, and so he had been stationed in Philippines, in all these different places he had been to. And so we both had gotten to do, a lot of the things that we would want, people would want to do. And so it was like we were both ready to settle down. And so we went on our first date, and that very first date I just felt comfortable with him. And it was a weird feeling because I'm an introvert by nature. And so, and I know those of you who know me now, you're probably like, what? And I'll get into that later, but it's the Ruach in me, it brought me out. But I was a big introvert. And so, and a typical thing about introverts that I thought was interesting, especially in light of a conversation a bunch of us were recently having about how those of us who have been called to the truth, it's like we've all felt different our entire lives, and no one any more so than I. I always felt different. Like I never fit in anywhere. And I didn't fit in because of my upbringing. I was homeschooled. Most kids can't say that. I was different, because I didn't get into all these things of the world. I was different, because my mom stayed home with us, and we were raised very, very sheltered. And so I was completely different, which may tie into how I came into the truth, which I'll get to here in a second. And so, anyways, so with my husband, I just felt comfortable. Like, we weren't doing the whole small talk dance and the dance around each other and the whole typical date, that you hear about and that most people experience. So again, it was like, I was different. And I felt like we were meant to be or something. And so about 9-10 months later, we got married in 2007, February 2007. And so and at that, okay, rewind just a little bit. So the church wanted to hire me. They wanted me to come on staff and run their worship team. And before Jeff and I started dating, they sat me down and like, hey, we want to hire you. And I was like, thanks, but no, I didn't want that. And then we started dating. Now I'm like in a quandary, like, how is this going to work? Because in my mind, I wasn't thinking, okay, come and be a part of the church. But the more I prayed about it, the more I felt like that's what I was supposed to do. And so I sat down with them and said, okay, things have changed. and they laughed and they were happy to have me. So I began working there full time in June of 2006. And so we got married February 3rd, 2007. And things, things were going great or whatever, or so I thought. And just kind of settled in for the ride. And in 2010, it was either 2010 or 2011, I had reached this point where I had put on a lot of weight and I wanted to lose weight. And so I kind of got into the regimen of, losing weight and kind of went along with the typical standards of, do this to lose weight and blah, blah, blah. And I had lost a bit of weight, like 20 pounds at this point, I think. And I was standing in the kitchen and I had pulled out this shake. And I think it was a glucerna shake. And for some reason, because I'd never thought of doing this before, I turned it over and I looked at the back at the ingredients, and I'm looking at these ingredients, all this stuff that I can barely pronounce, and all of a sudden the thought just came to me, why am I putting this in my body? And at that point I began to change my eating habits. I can only attribute the awareness that came to me in that moment from the Ruach, or people call it the Holy Spirit in the Bible, but the Hebrew word is Ruach. And so at that point, I knew it was the Ruach just leading me, because I didn't know where else that came from. It just came out of the blue. And so at that point, I began to change my eating habits, getting into more natural ways of eating and eating real foods. And I had kind of gone back and forth a little bit, trying to figure out the things to eat, not to eat, and there was all kinds of information out there, and this person saying this and this person saying that. And again, it was like the Ruach just spoke to me and said, what is it the Bible tells us to eat? What are the foods mentioned in the Bible? And so that's what I started going back to. And so I would go back to the word, when people would say, oh, you shouldn't eat this, like they would vilify things like wheat. And I'm going, but the Bible talks about wheat. For the Passover, they would eat unleavened bread for 7 days, where some people were saying, unfermented wheat was bad for you. Well, the Bible had, the Israelites eating unfermented wheat for a week. They had to get rid of every bit of fermentation out of their houses, and they would eat wheat, unfermented. So I'm like, okay, that's out. Maybe it's good for us, but in the natural state, it's not bad. And so, and that was kind of the beginning of my awakening of realizing that the world calls a lot of things bad that Yahuwah calls good. And we have to be careful that we aren't calling bad what he has called good. And that applies to a lot of things out there that have been vilified, that are natural things that are good for us when used the way they're meant to be. It's like TV. TV can be bad, or TV can be good and educational. It's all in how you use it. Just because people use TV in a bad way doesn't make it bad. Just because, people use sugar in a bad way doesn't make sugar bad. It doesn't make it the devil, And so that's what I began to realize in that moment. That was the very beginning, that I could say, of my awakening at that point. And also, what that also woke up in me was the realization that our world is not the way it seems. If we take it at face value, then we are deceived. And that's what I began to wake up to, because I began to learn about all these wars that were being waged against these small farmers who were trying to do things right. The ones providing us raw milk and, trying to provide us natural, organic things. And the government's waging war against them. And like, are there not enough crimes in the world that the government just has time to go around, assaulting farmers with SWAT teams? What is their crime? Raw milk. And so that began a process of waking me up to the way the world is operating. Truly operating, not the way the world wants us to think it's operating, but the way it really is operating, because those are two different things. And so that was the beginning. And at that time, one of the reasons that I was getting into losing weight and getting in shape and all that stuff was we were wanting to have children. And so that was the next major step, kind of into what was happening in my life. And so about two years after we started that, I was actually at a doctor trying to figure out why it wasn't happening. And this was actually a couple months before I got pregnant with our first child. And so I was asking them, what are my options to try to look into, what is going on, why this isn't happening. And when I walked out of the doctor's office, debating what my next step was, I just felt this strong impression that, not just impression, but he was speaking to me, and he was telling me that he didn't want me to go through with trying to make this happen myself. And I felt in that moment that, I knew him as God, but that he had a plan for us, and it didn't involve us getting involved. And something interesting that happened while I was living in Canada was I had met this lady from Guatemala, and I had tried to find out what my name meant, and at the time I couldn't find any information on my name. And I was talking to her, and I don't even think I brought up the subject of my name, and she brought it up, and she said, "Do you know where your name comes from?" And I said, "No, I've been trying to find that out." And she said, "The root of your name is Sarah. And the way they get Syreeta is they take Sarah and then they add Ita on the end, meaning little one. And so you get little Sarah, or little princess." And so I thought that was interesting in light of what Yahuwah was telling me in that moment, that I wasn't to intervene in this, that whatever was going to happen was what he wanted to happen, and just to let it happen, let it play out. And I didn't realize that would take me to what I thought were some of the lowest points in my life, which I'm getting to, but it would also take me through the journey that I needed to get through to see the truth. So about a couple months after that experience happened, and I said, okay, I'm going to leave it all in your hands. And a couple months later, I got pregnant. And so I'm thinking, yay, this is the answer to our prayer. And so 4 months later, my water breaks. And so I end up in the hospital trying to figure out what's going on, what are options, all that stuff. And during that time, he began to speak to me again. And the day that we said goodbye to our son, I woke up that morning and I heard him say, he's going to be delivered today. And I was freaking out because, delivery was exactly what we were trying to stop from happening because he was too early. And I was like, okay, so what are our options? What do we do? Where are we at with this? And all he told me was a verse. John 11:25. And the way I knew it, it says Jesus, but it said that he said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And so we were trying, to figure out, okay, what does that verse mean? And in the meantime, it was true. I was going into labor at that point. I hadn't been in active labor, and I was actually going into labor at that point. And so I told the nurse, and she checked me, and she verified, yeah, she's going into labor. When we got to the hospital, they had told us that basically what was going to happen because of the process of events that had been put into motion was that our son's heart was going to gradually slow and slow and slow and slow until it stopped. I'm pretty sure I don't have to tell you, those of you who are parents out there, that is like the most devastating news you could possibly ever hear. And I'm really trying not to cry on this video right now. And I know now that he knew my heart and that I couldn't take that. Because that never actually ended up happening. And so it was Wednesday, February 20th, 2013, and I tell you that exact date because of what would occur later that day. And I still have a newspaper clipping from that. So we're, it's about 2 o'clock, and they had told us, that morning, yes, you're going into labor. After he had told me you're going to deliver him today. And so about 2 o'clock, the nurse comes in, rolls in the ultrasound equipment. She takes she does the ultrasound, and the normal optimal heartbeat for a baby during pregnancy is usually between 180 and 130. So 130 to 180. So they came in and checked his heartbeat. His heartbeat was 150. It had never dropped below, I don't think it ever dropped below 150. So that was amazing in and of itself. And so the nurse left, and I felt Yahoo was speaking to me again. And it was a long conversation, but in the end he said, I'm going to give you a choice. And he said, I'm going to allow you, if you want, to keep him, but you need to realize what that choice will mean for him. That he's going to suffer, he's going to go through a lot of pain, a lot of suffering in order to survive. And then he said, or you can give him to me. Give him to me, I'll take him. Right now, no pain, no suffering. And at first I'm going, well, what kind of choice is that? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, if I held on to my son, it would be out of my selfishness, out of my decision to hang on to him because of what I want, and not necessarily because of what he wants or what he needs. And so I wrestled for about an hour, and then I finally said, okay, God, as I knew him then, Okay, God, I give him to you. You take him. And we believe that was right around 3 o'clock. And unbeknownst to us, outside, these huge storm clouds were gathering. There were these huge puffy clouds up in the sky, which I would come to find out later is actually very, very unusual for the winter time anywhere. And we think that was about, and I was pretty sure it was probably about 3 o'clock, and I finally rested, and I kept kind of wrestling with it, but the decision had been made. And so 4 o'clock, the nurse comes in. She wheels in ultrasound equipment, and she goes to check his heartbeat, and she can't find his heartbeat. And I knew he was gone. Just like you promised me. And outside, incredibly, here in Phoenix, it was starting to rain. But it was so cold outside, it began to snow. And there was snow and sleet and rain, and I think in some places there was hail coming down, and there was a huge double rainbow in the sky. And of course, we didn't know any of this was happening. We were dealing with the devastation and the loss. But I would come to realize later that he had given us this incredible day, and he had done it just for me. Because he had done it before. And he would do it again. And so we began walking through the very sad, very devastating, very new world of loss. And at this point, we're still a part of the church where Jeff and I met, and the response to us during our loss, of course, the first, couple weeks or so, everybody's, hugging you and loving you and caring about you. And then everybody goes back about, their own business while we're left picking up the pieces. And while we're still picking up the pieces, people are expecting us to, get back in the saddle and get back with it and get back to normal. What the heck is normal? After your whole world has imploded around you. And I'm really scratching my head going, what the heck is going on? And I'm like, this is not what I believe the Bible tells us that we're supposed to do. The Bible tells us, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn. And it's like, they cried with us for a second, but then, it was like, okay, get over it and And so that was the beginning of my awakening to the fact that the church was not what I thought it was. Here, I had been raised and taught that this is the church of the Bible. This is the church of the New Testament. I'm going, the more I see, the more this doesn't look like the church of the New Testament. And for us, it started with grief. And through a process of another set of events that I would look back and also realize was Yahuwah working. There were some accusations that were coming against me about things that they thought I had did. But the weird thing was nobody was ever confronting me to my face. They were going around talking to everybody behind my back. And I'm all but unaware of what is going on. And my husband's coming home they're telling me that you did this and you did that. I'm going, what? And I would recognize later that it was actually Yahuwah's process of getting me out of the church. And the reason being is that I was reaching the point where I knew that I couldn't deal with this set of circumstances that was thrown in our laps and deal with the church at the same time. Because to them, I had to be this fake person. And I was too tired. And those of you who have gone through deep grief, you know what I'm talking about. I was too tired to be fake. I didn't have time or the energy to put on my fake face and my fake smile and you know, get all done up and go act like the fake phony Christian. I couldn't do it. But I also wasn't ready to take the step to actually make that happen. And so Yahuwah was making it for me. And so I realized later, he set up that set of circumstances and that chain of events that eventually pushed me out of the door, and I was let go. And the official firing date for me was July 4th, 2013, believe it or not. And so that was the day I quit working for the church and never went back. Not to work for them anyways. And so I didn't go back to service. And they kept asking me, and they were trying to make me feel guilty for not going to services. And I'm like, look, I don't want to deal with you people. You want me to be fake, and you want me to be this, and you want me to be, I can't be who you think I'm supposed to be. I'm going to be who I need to be, because I'm the one dealing with this mess of grief and loss and pain and suffering, and all you are is up in my face. So I was free of that. I didn't feel free at the time, but I would look back and realize I was free. And so I was free to be me. I was free to be who I needed to be to deal with what we were going through. And at that point, I kind of, what I thought was, you know, and what of course they thought was, you know, me spiraling and backsliding. But the truth, it was the beginning of me walking towards the truth. And it was the beginning of me seeing the truth of what the church is and saying, I don't want any part of that. And so, long story, a little bit shorter, we went through a lot of things, and in October of that same year, I got pregnant again. And that was our second son, who we named Isaac. Our first son, we named him Jonathan. And our second son, we named Isaac. And we lost him in January of 2014. And at that point, the church had actually been regretting their decision to fire me because it didn't work out so well. And so they were actually telling my husband that they wanted to talk to me because they wanted to bring me back. And at that point, I lost our second son, and I was like, heck no, I'm not going back. I'm not dealing with, nope. That mess is not going to happen. And so at that point, I kind of spiraled. I was having a lot of pain due to the second loss. The first loss we had at the hospital, but because of that and what they told us when my water broke with our second son, they were like, they couldn't give me any answers, and they couldn't give me any even reassuring anything that they could look into this and help me with it. And so at that point I was just like, well, what use are you? And so it was like, if we're going to just keep losing our kids, then, you know, why are we paying thousands of dollars to do it at the hospital? I can do that at home. And so that's what happened the second time. I delivered my son at home. Our second son at home for the first time. I was experiencing some pains as a result of that, and so my thought process was, I don't want to go on prescription drugs, so I turned to alcohol. And of course, people thought, you know, I was just this massive sinner and backslidden completely and blah blah blah. And yes, what I was doing was wrong. I was getting drunk. But what I realized was the alternative was actually 100 times worse, and that would have been to turn to prescription drugs to deal with it. And I will get into that as well. And so after a while, I had gotten to the point that I was drinking so much that I tried to stop and I couldn't. And that kind of scared me. And so I prayed and I was like, okay, God, I need help with this. How do I quit this? I'm not going to rehab. I'm not going to do any of that stupid stuff. Show me what to do. And he did. He actually showed me exactly what I needed to do, and I would find out years later that it is exactly one of the things that they do in rehab centers to help people get off of heavy drinking, which I thought was pretty incredible. And so I was able to beat that, and I was able to cut back to almost nothing at that point. That was the around September, October of 2014. Yahuwah had begun to set me free from being chained to too much alcohol. And so at that point, something incredible happened, and it actually happened twice. And remember, I talked about how that snow that happened the night of our son, which was actually one of the literally handful of recorded snowfalls in Phoenix, that it actually, enough snow fell that they were actually able to record it, which has only happened a handful of times, as was listed in the newspaper article that my dad saved for me. And so during that time, I just began to feel like this weight was lifting off of me. And I had been under this heavy cloak of grief and dealing with that, dealing with the losses. And it just, in that time period, it began to lessen. Not go away completely at that point, but lessen. And I knew that was significant because I was feeling kind of lighter. And come December of that year, which was 2014, my husband decided he wanted to go on this birthday trip of his to see the Chargers play in San Diego. So we went and did that, and we ran all over southwestern California, going from stadium to stadium. And then he ended the trip with this trip to Palm Springs. And he was telling me there's this tramway that shoots you up to the top of this mountain. And I'm going, where? Palm Springs? What? I couldn't picture it. But when we got there, I was like, wow, I did not know this was here. And so we get there, and we're being shot up to the top of the mountain, and we can start to see snow on the mountain. And I was just amazed, like, wow, this is amazing. And we got to the top, and there was snow everywhere, but it wasn't snowing. So we get to the top, and we're walking around, and then not 5 minutes after we got to the top of that mountain, it began to snow. And I was just blown away. Because I knew who was bringing the snow, and I knew why. And I knew it was for me. He was showing off for me, showing me that this was him. And I was just blown away. And if I remember correctly, it actually stopped snowing just before we left the mountain. And then it happened again. In a way of sorts. We're supposed to be going up to this retreat, or my husband was supposed to be going up to this church retreat. He was still working at the church at the time. I was no longer working there. And so normally what they do is, if a staff member is by themselves or bringing their spouse, they don't give them special housing for if he was coming by himself, he would have been, dormed with everybody else. Or because I was not on staff, we probably shouldn't have gotten the house that we did. But because Yahuwah knew me. They offered us a cabin to ourselves, and just before we're supposed to go up there, it starts snowing. In fact, we were getting warnings of the snowstorm, and this is not normal for Prescott. This is normal for other parts of northern Arizona, but not for Prescott. I don't think they get very much snow. Prescott's not really known for, hey, let's jump in the car and go play in the snow in Prescott. No, it's jump in the car and go play in the snow in Flagstaff or, the White Mountains or places like that, but not Prescott. But Prescott was getting dumped on. And everybody was being warned, oh, don't go up there yet. We don't know if, it's going to be canceled or whatnot. And Jeff and I looked at each other and we're like, we're going. So we jump in the car because he knew I wanted to see the snow. And so we jump in the car and we drove up there. And I knew that Yahoo was showing off again for me because there are two different types of trips that are my favorite. You usually hear the debate about, are you a beach person or are you a mountains person? Well, I'm both. Optimal vacation for me is just chilling at the beach doing nothing, or optimal vacation number 2 is up in the mountains, enjoying a cabin, just locked away somewhere, and ideally in the snow with nothing to do, just chill. And so this is exactly where I find myself, in the midst of a snowstorm, in a cabin, and I'm not on staff, so I don't have to do anything. And so I've got it was 2 or 3 days to just do nothing, just chill in this cabin. And it was awesome. And so I'm scrapbooking and just having a blast. And it was just like something in me was just raising this awareness of who all this was coming from. Because I kept questioning, God. I was like, I kept feeling like he wanted something from me. And so I kept asking him, what do you want from me? What do you want? What do you want? And he would never say anything. And he would just keep doing all this stuff. And I'm like, okay. And so I'm sitting in this cabin in the snow, nothing to do except what I want to do, which was scrapbook. And I was doing that and having a blast. And it was just like it all just kind of came in and hit me like a ton of bricks what was going on. I knew it was him. And I knew he had something to say. He just hadn't said it yet. And so in that moment came a moment that I didn't realize the ramifications of until later down the road. But in that moment, I just stopped and I said, okay, God, I'm listening. And the passage that struck me later when I was contemplating the chain of events that happened from that is the story of Samuel. Because I went back and I began to realize that in a way, somehow I represented that character somehow. Through a series of events, my mom had lost the baby she was carrying before she got pregnant with me. And I haven't had a chance to ask her this, but I have a sneaking suspicion that if she hadn't lost that child, I would never have been born. And so I knew that was hugely significant because that was something my parents actually didn't reveal to me until after we had lost our first son. And in 1 Samuel 3:8-9, it says, and Yahuwah called Shamuel again the third time, and he rose and went to Eli and said, here am I, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived that Yahuwah had called the child. Therefore Eli said to Shamuel, go lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, speak Yahuwah, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and laid down in his place. And so when he went back and he laid down, it says in verse 10, and Yahuwah came and stood and called as at the other times, Shamuel, Shamuel. Then Shamuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth. And that was the passage that he gave me that I realized represented that time, that he was calling me, but he wasn't saying anything, not yet. He was just waiting for me to stop and recognize that he was the one who was calling me. And in that moment, I said, okay, I'm listening. And that's when things began to explode in our lives. So that was the first point where I began to wake up in a new way, and so far a unique way from a lot of other people who have woken up. In all of our cases, it was Yahuwah leading us. But for some reason, my experience was very different, because I seriously made the wake-up jump by way of prophecy. And so in that moment, when I said, okay, I'm listening, I began to prophesy things. And one of the things that I do recall, because I just suddenly began experiencing this ridiculously boundless, unlimited energy, where I was like talking all day and barely sleep at night, and just going on and on. And some things I would just felt like I was rambling about, and I didn't know. I was like, what is this? And one of the things I was talking about, and I was telling my husband, and I was driving him nuts because he wasn't getting much sleep during this time either. And I told him I kept picturing like this train that's going east, and all these people are on this train, and they're all just partying and having a good time, and they're headed east. And then there's this train going west, and there's not a lot of people on it. And I told him, I feel like he's showing me that we're on the train going west. He's put us on the train going west. And he's had to do a lot of things that we didn't like for him to get us on that train going west. And I kept talking about things like that and other things, and just I would get all these ideas and stuff. And during this time, I also I got promoted at work. I had during 2014, I had started a new job, and I was working for U-Haul, and it was a job I didn't really want to get, and I didn't think I'd actually like, but it turns out I got it, and I did like it. But the real blessing that came from it was through my boss there. And I had come from, like I told you, the church, which was, not very understanding through our grieving process. And so Yahuwah leads me into this job where my manager, she hadn't lost any children, but she had lost a lot of close relatives, enough that she knew that process of deep grief. And so she would know, when I had lost it and I was done and there was no more work left in me, because I had been on a bad call or something. And so one call I was on, this lady had a screaming newborn in the background, and the baby screamed through the entire call. And of course she kept staying on the line. I couldn't get off the line fast enough. And by the time I got off the line, I was just bawling. And I was just like, because it was a trigger for me with our loss. And so I called my manager, and she's like, yeah, I get it. You're done. Get off the phone. You're done for the day. That was just, to me, that was incredible. And she was always like that. She would understand, and she was an amazing manager. And it was like going from night and day. It was like I was in night under the church, and then going to that job, ironically, which is supposed to be, the secular job, it was like difference of night and day. And it was what one of those many pieces that Yahuwah gave me that helped with me healing and getting to the point that I got to. So in that job, I got promoted, which I laughed at. I was like, why are you guys promoting me? And they actually unanimously, it was 3 of them that made the decision. They were like, unanimously, we promoted you because you asked questions. And that would come back to me in a big way. And they were like, you ask questions and you want to know how to do the job better, and you always, you're always enthused about doing, the best job you can do. And it wasn't because I was the greatest salesperson on the phone. I did a lot better than I thought I would, but it was because I asked questions. And so I get promoted, my husband gets promoted, and then at the same time, I get pregnant again. This is the third time. And so, I think my husband had said if it was a boy, he wanted to name him Jedediah. So my husband had named all three of our first three boys. And so come May, that whole, prophesying a little bit and experiencing all these things lasted about 2 weeks. And then we kind of settled back into our routine. And at this point, it was actually kind of funny because just before I had gotten pregnant, I had gotten promoted. And so we were like, okay, let's make all these plans. We'll travel here. We'll go do this. And we had actually seriously contemplated going to visit my friend Jen, who lived in Japan at the time. And it was just like one of those classic moments where, Yahuwah just sat back and laughed. Oh, you're making your own plans, huh? You just wait. And so so when we found out, that I was pregnant again, we were like, okay, scrap the plans. So come May, and it was actually Mother's Day of all days. And it was Mother's Day, Sunday, May 10th, and my water broke. And I was actually off that weekend, and I realized it was Yahuwah's timing, because normally I would have been working on a Sunday. But I had been training that week, and with training we get Saturday and Sundays off, and so I was off when that happened. And so that training week was my last week at that job. Actually, it was my last week at any job. I just didn't know that then. And so my water broke, and we lost our third son, Jed. And at that point, it was just like I was so tired of the up and down roller coaster that I felt like we were on. And I was just like, off. I need off. Give me off. I can't stand this. And so at that point, I started drinking again, and no, I started drinking just after what happened, actually. I was bleeding a lot. I was having some problems. I was feeling really dizzy. And so I was kind of wondering what should I do? Because I was pretty anti-hospital at that point, but I was kind of panicking because I didn't understand what was going on. And when I prayed and asked him, I felt like he said, return and I will heal you. And I didn't understand in that moment that he wasn't referring to me going to the hospital or not going to the hospital. He was talking about me returning to him, returning to the Elohim of my fathers and my father's fathers, my ancestors, who I would find out later down the road who they are. But I was confused in that moment, and I was like, okay, well, I'm going to the hospital. So I went to the hospital. We called the ambulance because I didn't know if I could walk. And so, in the moment they picked me up, I knew I had made the wrong decision, and I was in trouble. So I get to the hospital, and immediately on their number one agenda is to do a D&C, which those of you familiar with abortion, D&C is actually an abortion. The only problem with this is I had already delivered my son. And so he was already gone. There was nothing to do in D&C on. And what they told me was they did an ultrasound, and they said the wound is empty, but there's some air in there, so we want to go in there and make sure that there's nothing left in there. And I'm like, no. And the moment I told them no, the war was on. Because for whatever reason, The enemies were determined that that was supposed to happen to me. And now I strongly suspect why it was. And I kind of knew after, when all of that happened. But that he was trying to take me out again. And so we are warring with the doctors, warring with the nurses, because they are dead set on their agenda and we're dead set against it. And so it was literally army against army. And I was beginning to see the hospital for what it was. A fortress where you're locked in until they let you go. And in fact, when I got into the hospital, I told my husband not to sign any papers until he had read them. And he didn't read them, he signed them. And then I found out later that what you do is you basically sign your rights away to them. And Yahuwah had been warning me of that, and that's why I felt that I needed to check on that. But I couldn't because I was dealing with the doctors, dealing with the pain and all that. So they come in and they tell us that we have two options, basically. When I had gotten there, they'd given me a medication that caused hemorrhaging. And they told me, well, it's supposed to get rid of all the, the old blood that you don't need. And I'm going, I'm hemorrhaging, and then they come in and they're telling me you need a blood transfusion. I'm going, if I was getting rid of the old blood that I don't need, why do I now need a blood transfusion? And so when we opted for the blood transfusion and not the D&C that they still wanted, then they kept withholding the blood transfusion, and I'm bleeding out. And my family's starting to panic, and I'm starting to panic. I'm going, I could feel it. It's like I can feel my lifeblood draining out of me, and I'm going, I'm dying. And Yahoo told me, you're not dying. You're not going yet. It's not time. And so that encouraged me. But we still had a war with these doctors and nurses to get me out of here alive. And so they finally came, they did the blood transfusion, but they were still fighting us because they still wanted the D&C. And I felt in that moment him speaking and telling me, yes, you're in trouble, but if you turn the situation over to me, I will get you out of here. And so I said, okay, I don't know what to do, so you take it. And in that moment, the Ruach came into me and began to speak through me and speak to the doctors and nurses, things that I never would have dreamed of saying to them, and eventually talked them down to the point that we were almost able to walk out of there. And just as we were getting ready to leave, a bunch of the big doctors that never show up for anything, they walk into the room and they're like, well, so we think you need to do the D&C, and we do have the right to hold you if we want to against your will. They told me that. And I knew that wasn't going to happen because, the Ruach had already spoken to me and was speaking through me, and I knew he was Yahuwah was in control. He was going to take care of this. And so I was like, and I talked so much that I ran the doctors out of the room. Doctors usually talk your ear off. I talked their ear off, ran them out of the room. And so they left, and then the nurse came in, and she was, trying to talk to us and figure out, what's going to happen next. And we were like, we're done. We're out of here. And they're like, well, we don't recommend it, so you have to go AMA, against medical advice, to leave. And we said, done. We're doing it. Well, what I would realize years later was that behind the scenes, they were making plans to keep me there. To basically decide, okay, she's, endangering her life, so we're going to take charge. Because that's what they had threatened when they came in the room before. And so we're packing up to leave, and the nurse is bringing in the paperwork for me to sign and get out of there. And a voice comes on the radio and says, are they going AMA, against medical voice advice? And it was this conversation that made me realize later what they were actually planning. And Yahuwah had spoken to this nurse and was directing her actions. And she told them, no, they're not going against medical advice. They're being released. And we walked out of there. I get home, and what I didn't know was that I was still, the Ruach was still speaking through me. And when I got home, I felt this huge weight of relief, and I was just so relieved. And then I began to speak, and it wasn't me speaking, it was the Ruach. And I spoke to my mother, and I told her something that only she could know, that she had asked God about, and I told her the answer, because he was revealing to her that he was speaking, so that she would know that later on, when she rejected who was speaking, who she was rejecting, I would know that, at least. And I told my mom in that moment, I said that he was speaking to her, and that she needed to make a choice, and that she needed to choose to do the right thing. Otherwise, she would lose both her daughters. And I was referring to my sister Nicole, who was also there. And I think I said something along the lines of, you need to choose the right daughter, otherwise you will end up losing them both. And I talked about a bunch of other things. I talked to my husband about a number of things, and there were things that I said that I didn't understand, like I like cats, which I do like cats, but I didn't realize it wasn't about me. It was about something that I needed to see later on down the road. And so this would happen again after about a month, and for the sake of time, I won't get into all of what happened then, but Yahuwah showed up and showed me his love. And because I was still at the point where I was like, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I can't stand this roller coaster. I'm getting sick. I'm getting off. And I said, I'm getting off until you show me that you are real. Of course, you're probably thinking, after all that hospital experience and everything that happened, you didn't know he was real. Yeah, I know. But in the mindset of loss, I was dealing with that. And so that was blinding me to everything. And so I was like, show me that you were real. And so we go to the same church that didn't show us very much love and support. And I walked into the youth service. My husband was the youth pastor there. And so I walked into the youth service, and the kids they had planned this entire thing for Jeff, just to recognize him as a father. It was the day before Father's Day. And which is, not something people were really doing anymore. It was just like, oh, their third loss, okay, whatever. But the kids, and I realize now why Yahuwah tells us to come, that we have to enter into his kingdom as children. Otherwise, we don't get in at all. Because the children see, and they know. And so they had recognized Jeff, and I happened to be at that service. And so they just wrapped their arms around all of us, and we just all cried together for 30 minutes. So exactly what I knew that all the adults were refusing to do, that the Bible tells us to do with those who are grieving, is what the kids did with us. And it blew me away. And I knew he was answering me. And so 2 days later, I'm sitting in my living room, and I said, okay, God. I was hearing him speaking that passage in Isaiah 6 verse 8, where it says, also I heard the voice of Yahuwah saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I knew he was asking me this question. Who can I send? Who will go for me? And Isaiah said, then said I, here am I, send me. And I knew he was asking me that question. And he had shown me a song, and he told me, I want you to lead my people in a sacrifice of praise. Now, mind you, I hadn't been singing for the past couple years. I set it on the back burner. It wasn't important to me at all. And in that moment, he told me, I want you to lead my people in a sacrifice of praise. And then he asked me, who shall I send and who will go for us? And I said, okay, God, here am I, send me. And immediately he showed me the passage right after that says, go and tell these people I thought I put it here. One second. Nope, I didn't put it here, so I'm going to paraphrase. So he says, go and tell these people, be seeing but never perceiving, be hearing but never understanding. Make the hearts of these people callous, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, turn and be healed. And what I didn't realize in that moment was that he was also talking about my family, who I was about to come into confrontation with. And so when I said yes to him, again, the Ruach took over, and I began to prophesy, and I began to talk day and night. And I'd been drinking up until this time, and I stopped in that moment. And it should have affected me, but it didn't. And I was up day and night, which should have affected me, but it didn't. And I was talking almost nonstop, and I didn't sleep for somewhere around 3 to 5 days. And so I was just prophesying day and night. And what he showed me later is that exactly what was happening to me is what is talked about in Joel 2, verse 28. And it says, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Ruach upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. And also upon the servants and upon the handmaids in those days, I will pour out my Ruach. And that is what was taking place in that moment. And so I was talking nonstop. I was talking about a whole number of things. And I actually had to spend an entire year writing down everything that he was showing me and what some of it meant in that moment. And he would continue to reveal to me what a number of these things meant. And at one point, it was Wednesday of that week. And because June 22nd was the day that I said yes. 2 days later, my family shows up, and they're freaking out. And so Yahuwah was showing me the people that I was coming into contact with, what their strongholds were, the things that were holding them back, the things keeping them from hearing him, those things stopping up their ears and closing their eyes and dulling their understanding. For my pastor, and at that time, and also my husband, as a result of being under that pastor, the stronghold is money. For my parents, the stronghold is a spirit of the Pharisees. For my sister, it was a more seductive spirit driving her. And I kept referring to the whore of Babylon in her case. And my sister is a whole different story I probably won't have time to get into now, but I confronted my parents, and I'm confronting them with scripture, and they're not having it. And I'm talking about the passage that talks about the Pharisees being the whitewashed tombs, but all the junk that's inside. And their understanding is so dull, they're not getting it. And I watched my dad as he walked into my house, and he didn't even look around at what was in the house. And he sat down, and I said, did you look around and see what's in my house? Because I had these various things set out for them to see, because they had a reason and purpose for being there. And he says, I've already seen all that I need to see. He didn't see anything. I watched him walk in. And I said, oh, really? And he said something at some point. He's like, I already know everything that there is that I need to know. And I'm speaking through the Ruach. So it's not me speaking. It's the Ruach. And the Ruach was like, oh, really? Do you know everything about your daughter that you need to know? And so the Ruach started listing off things that my dad did not know. And the Ruach's like, oh, did you know that about your daughter? Oh, did you know this about your daughter? Oh, did you know this about your daughter? And my mom is getting more heated, and my dad's getting mad because he can see me constantly looking at my mom, because my mom should know better. And so before too long, it ended up, the face-to-face confrontation. And my mom knew it wasn't me speaking, because I kept referring to myself in the third person. It was the Ruach speaking. And so my mom finally said, where's my daughter? I want to speak to my daughter. And the Ruach said something very profound that I did not realize the ramifications for until I discovered the Father's true name. The Ruach said, you tell me what my name is, and I will call your daughter forth. He said, what is my name? Tell me what my name is. You do that, and I'll call your daughter forth. And my mother got livid. And so she got in my face, and before long, she was speaking her gibberish tongues. And I looked at her and said through the Ruach, I said, what are you doing? Are you trying to cast demons on me? And I said, you can't cast demons out of me, because there are no demons in me to cast out. And then finally, it got to the point my mom looked at me and she said, she was talking to Ruach. She knew she wasn't talking to me. She knew who she was talking to. Or the spirit behind her knew. And she said, you need to leave and my daughter can stay. And the Ruach told her, your daughter knows that there's only one that she's safe with. And that's who she's staying with. And so if you want us to leave, we'll all go together. And she kept saying, you need to go, you need to go. And so finally I said, okay. And I picked up my keys and I walked out the door. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall when that happened, because they all flipped out because I actually left. And so then I came back the next day and they were all freaking out, and they decided, because I had said that I was going to leave again, that they needed to hold me down. And so they literally took 4 of them to pin me down. And that was an interesting confrontation in and of itself. Later, after, long story, the police came and left. Yeah, talked them down from that. And I sat on the couch and I just kept saying, I think I got all the time in the world. All the time in the world. And then I kept singing a song, and I didn't realize why or what it meant until later. And I kept saying, there's no time to change your mind. The sun has come and you've been left behind. And I didn't know where all this stuff was coming from, because it wasn't coming from me. It wasn't me saying it. It was the Ruach. And so finally, I left the house again. And then when I came back, they were gone. And so that was a very interesting week, to say the least. And that's just a small part of it, but that's part of it. And so, but from those moments, I began to wake up to the way the world works and began to see with his eyes, because that's what he wanted me to do. That's what he wanted me to see. See what was driving them, that's keeping them blind and deaf and dumb. And through that process, it eventually led to a chain of events where I was to return to the church one last time and to talk to them and to give them one last chance to repent for not following him. And he set in motion a chain of events that the pastor didn't want to happen, but Yahuwah wanted it to happen, and so it happened. And so I took the stage when the pastor didn't want me to, and gave them one last chance. And then the pastor got up a few months later and he talked about the same topic that I had addressed, hearing God's voice. And he said, well, we only hear from God occasionally. And he went off about that in some silly illustration, and Yahuwah showed me later that was the showdown he had shown me when I started prophesying that was supposed to happen. That was his response, and that was his rejection. And so that led to a chain of events that led to us leaving that church for good. So at the time that we left that church, I was dealing with some stuff because another pregnancy had happened, but it was a weird one because there wasn't actually a baby. It was a bizarre pregnancy. And so it threw me off. And so that happened just as we were leaving the church. And so even though I saw all these things happening, it was like my heart just still hardened because I hadn't gotten to that point where I actually knew him for who he is. I was coming to know about the attributes of him and the fact that this God who was speaking to me is not the God that the Christians claim that they follow and that they claim that they worship. And so I knew that was separate, but I was still coming into the truth. And so I got blindsided by what happened. And so I kind of took the sidelines for a few months. And so Yahuwah would use another interesting chain of events to awaken me that also would eventually lead to me finding warriors of the Ruach.